We're going to be talking today about West and Central Asia. When we talk about this region of the world in relation to art history, one of the things that we see is that this is a region where there's a tremendous amount of interchange from different cultural uh, groups of people and different cultural backgrounds. We see the interchange really that takes place between Europe and Asia, between Islam, Buddhism, Christianity. So the art from this region is really incredibly rich and incredibly diverse. And we're going to be seeing quite a few different examples of how this manifests itself, really from the ancient period all the way up into much more contemporary society. We're going to start today by talking about one of the earlier traditions that we see in this region, which is seen in the ancient ruins of Petra. So here we're looking at an image from the ancient city of Petra, and a little bit of background about Petra in terms of the history of this region. This area was originally populated, it was early back, really as the second millennium BC, by a group of people known as the Edomites, and then several other people have inhabited this region as well throughout history. But the structures that we're looking at here, and what we'll really primarily be talking about, are buildings that were created by a group of people known as the Nabataeans. So the Nabataeans are well known primarily for for their rock cut architecture, and also for their ability to deal with irrigation and fairly complex water systems, which is a real necessity when you're living in a desert like we see here. The city of Petra was well known in biblical times. It was also well known during the Roman period. In fact, it was conquered by Pompey, and then eventually absorbed fully into the Roman Empire under the reign of Trajan. And the word Petra actually comes from the Latin word petrae, or petrus, which means rock. And so this refers specifically to the architecture here, which is largely carved directly from the living rock. The most important, the most famous structures that we see are primarily tombs. We do see other structures as well, including theater. We see large temple complexes, and these are often built out of stone in a more traditional fashion. But the best known examples of architecture here certainly are the ones that are carved directly out of the rock faces. The city of Petra is located in modern-day Jordan, and it's really quite isolated. It was actually lost to history for close to 2,000 years until it was rediscovered by a Swiss explorer named Johann Burckhardt and reintroduced to the world in 1812. What we're looking at here is the view of one of the most famous structures of Petra, known as the Treasury, Al-Khazne in Arabic. And we're looking at it here from the Seek, which is a very, very narrow canyon, which basically leads up into this region. Petra is basically the way it's organized. Really, is you've got a wider area where you would have had basically the homes, the temples, and some of the main primary structures surrounded by canyons. And within these canyons were a series of carved tombs, including the one that we can just barely get a peek of here. The Nabataeans were also really quite well known for their ability to manage water. Canyons like this one actually were used to include narrow channels that were carved into the stone, which would have housed terracotta or ceramic pipe, which carried water at a consistent 4-degree angle over about a 5-mile distance from a local spring, which would have been their primary supply of water. It also appears that they were able to dam many of these narrow slot canyons and use them deliberately as reservoirs, and also that way to kind of prevent damage or loss of life due to flash floods. So we're looking here at the most famous structure from Petra. And this is one some of you may recognize. It's quite famous. We've seen it before in movies, video games. Of course, probably most famously shows up in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. In movies and other sources like that, the interior of this structure is often rendered as being quite remarkable. But in truth, these tombs have elaborate exteriors, but very, very plain, unadorned interiors. They're quite simple. Some of them, of course, have niches carved into them for housing human remains. And there's about 800 tombs throughout the city of Petra. But generally on the interior, they're very, very simple. These were carved using some pretty interesting techniques and processes. In terms of how they did this, more than likely they would essentially use a series of carved trenches or ledges, really, that they would lead up to the top part of where the structure was going to begin. Kind of carve a narrow ledge at the very, very top, and carve into that and establish the upper part of the structure, and then work their way down, sculpting as they went. And this is a process that it seems to make the most sense logically in terms of how these could have been created. Now, in terms of the design, when we look at these buildings and at the treasury, the Al-Khazna, and several other buildings from Petra, we can see some really interesting influences. We see architectural forms that are reminiscent of ancient Mesopotamia, including forms that are clearly Assyrian. We see Greek imagery. We look at some of the pediments and the temple facades, and Roman imagery as well. And these seem to combine a variety of different elements. The structure we're looking at here, in fact, probably most closely resembles some of the painting, the second style painting that we've seen from a specific villa at Bosco Reale, from the villa of Publius Sinistor. And we have that same kind of broken triangular pediment with a tholos in the middle that we can see at the top of this image. There's another image here of the Al-Khazna, or the treasury again. And we can again see here how this relates so similarly to some of the other architectural forms that we've seen when we talk about ancient Greece and ancient Rome in particular. But none of these columns are functional. Again, this is all carved directly out of the living rock. The name treasury, by the way, is really a misnomer. This was never a treasury. It strictly was used as a tomb. But the Nabataeans were legendary in terms of their wealth. They managed to occupy a very important nexus, a crossroads, really, in terms of trade. And because of the trade routes that went through this region, the Nabataeans were able to serve as really a loci for materials and goods passing through the region. And if you wanted water and you wanted to be able to survive, these were important way stations. And the Nabataeans controlled this region. So on the map here, we can get a little bit better idea of what I'm referring to in terms of trade. If you look up at the top end, the northern end of the map, you can see Petra close to the Mediterranean Sea there. And this is really an important crossroads. In particular, frankincense and myrrh are important items, trade goods that pass through this region frequently at this period in history. And they would have levied taxes. They would have had, of course, control over the trade routes, and so the Nabataeans were really quite wealthy, and this is probably one of the things that led to people believing that there may have been gold or other exotic treasures and plunder that would have been hidden within the city of Petra. And here we're looking at another image, a close-up really of the treasury, and we can see the unusual architecture and the Greek and Roman influence that we can see here. There are also a series of carved markings on either side of this structure, which are a little bit enigmatic, but more than likely were carved much later as handholds or footholds in order to try to get up into the upper part of this two-story structure in an attempt to try and find any hidden treasure. Here we're looking at the Great Temple in Petra, and you can see the monumental staircase that leads up onto the massive stone platform. This would have originally have been surrounded by about 100 columns, and underneath this structure, it's interesting, there are several channels which appear to have been intended as irrigation or water channels, essentially. They were used for the management and movement of water. Again, in order to survive in this region, in the desert, the Nabataeans had to be very good at managing this resource, and it appears that they really were masters of hydraulic technology in that respect. So moving forward in history, we'll be talking a little bit about some other structures that we find in West and Central Asia, and we're going to be talking a little bit about Buddhism. Now, of course, we talk about Buddhism quite a bit when we talk about South and Southeast Asia. But when we're talking about Afghanistan, for example, we also see some examples of Buddhist imagery. And Buddhist imagery is very, very different from what we see when we talk about Islamic art, for example, that we'll be also exploring in detail during this unit. Whereas Islamic art is typically devoid of figural imagery, Buddhist art is really the opposite of this. Figural art is one of the most important central ways of communication in Buddhist art. And the figural imagery that we see is used to communicate, really, to teach us about Buddha. We see various attendants, teachers, practitioners, deities. Sometimes they're in shrine settings, in landscapes, palaces of ideal Buddhist worlds, like in a mandala, for example. And this can be represented in carving or in painting and a variety of other media. The image that we're looking at here is known as one of the Bamiyan Buddhas. This is the largest of the Bamiyan Buddhas from Afghanistan. And it was created somewhere between about 400 and 800 of the Common Era. The most likely explanations at the time that this was created is probably between about 591 and 644. But they were built probably by the Kushans with the guidance of some of the local Buddhist monks. The region that we're looking at here in Afghanistan was part of the Silk Road, and so trade goods were carried again from the east, from China, through this region to the west. And there were a series of Buddhist monasteries, also the many caves surrounding this area, which would have been inhabited in some cases by Buddhist monks. And so this is an ancient historical site, and this site, of course, is located in modern-day Afghanistan. And if we look at this next image here, we can get an even better idea just of the scale, the complexity of this enormous Buddha. You can see a figure standing there in the foreground near the feet of this enormous statue and get some idea of the complexity of this huge image, which is carved out of the living rock. Now, the next image that we're looking at here is going to maybe a little disturbing. So what we're looking at here is the fate of this Buddha. In 2001, the Buddha that we're looking at there, and actually two of the Buddhas. There's another one. This one, initial one we talked about there, was almost 60 meters high, and then here's another one that's about 35 meters next to it. And these were blown up by the Taliban in 2001. This was obviously widely condemned as a horrible act. But the Taliban didn't really care because they saw these images as being blasphemous images of false idols, deities, worship, etc. Of course, and we know that in Islamic art and culture, figural imagery like this is essentially prohibited, and so these were unfortunately destroyed and lost to the world. One of the most sacred images in Buddhism is an object called the Jowo Rinpoche, which is located today in the Jokhang Temple. And this object is said to have actually been blessed by the Buddha himself. But we do know that it has had a very long and very storied history. It's said that if you see this object in person, if you visit it, will quicken your path to enlightenment. Again, it's considered to be a very sacred and very important image in Buddhism, and certainly the most sacred image in Tibet. The structure, the object that you see here, does have a recorded history which goes back to at least the 7th century of the Common Era. And some things have happened to it more recently as well. The temple that it's located in was actually gutted and partially destroyed in the 60s. And the statue inside, the original bronze statue, disappeared. The lower part of it was then rediscovered, actually, basically in the trash in 1983. The upper half was relocated in Beijing, and now they've been reassembled, put back together, and put back into the temple that we see here. The structure the object was partially restored due to a man by the name of Rinpo Rinpoche, who was a revered lama. He was jailed by the Chinese army in 1959 for about 20 years, and then eventually released. And so the name, the Jowo, also bears his name. It's now referred to as the Jowo Rinpoche as a result, and it has, of course, been returned to Tibet.